warm welcome to His Holiness, our distinguished guests, friends and colleagues to the second day of the conference. Uh, for our first session of the day, I now invite Dr. Clifford Saron, University of California, Davis, Mr. K.G. Chandy, Rishi Valley School, Krishnamurti Foundation, India, Andhra Pradesh, Dr. Nandini Chatterjee Singh, National Brain Research.
Later.
No, she's later.
We call Ashram.
Later, okay.
और नंदनी चैट वो भी तो शिफ्ट हो गई है सॉरी उसका
है वहाँ पे
कहाँ है
नहीं
Not there. I need नंदनी
to share their experiential and experimental research findings with us. Dr. Ashum Gupta, Department of Psychology, will be the moderator for this session. I invite her to. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
Your Holiness and the distinguished speakers on the dais, I take this opportunity to thank Professor Meenakshi Thapan, first of all, who has provided me this great opportunity. I'm very much honored to be here as a moderator for the session which is being presided by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. For this session, we have very distinguished speakers who have conducted very scientific research in different walks of life, but of course they are focusing on some specific aspects of their research. To start with, we have Dr. Clifford Saron. I would just give a brief background to him. Of course, many of us know him very well for his research conducted over the last few decades. Dr. Clifford Saron, a research scientist at the Center for Mind and Brain and Mind Institute at the University of California at Davis. He has received his PhD in neuroscience from the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in 1999. Dr. Saron has had a long-standing interest in the effect of contemplative practices. Dr. Saron is principal investigator for the prestigious project called Shamatha Project, a multidisciplinary, longitudinal investigation of the effects of long-term intensive meditation on physiological and psychological processes central to well-being, attention, emotion regulation, and health. It's a great honor that we are all here to listen to him. We have other two speakers, and I would be introducing them a little later. So may I now invite Dr. Saron to deliver his talk.
Thank you very much, Ashum. Your Holiness, it's a wonderful and distinct honor and privilege to be able to present some of our latest thinking and to review with you some of the work we've been doing on the Shamatha project, and to share with this august audience some of our findings. So on behalf of all of my colleagues and students and collaborators, I'm deeply indebted to the Kotari Center and to Minashki Tapan and all the organizers for this distinct opportunity. I've titled my talk, Consequences of Contemplation, Scientific Studies in Relation to Teacher Formation, because the emphasis of this meeting is related to the training of teachers to train students in the deepest way to appreciate the majesty of lived experience. So all of the qualities of mind that I'm going to be talking about in this talk really, I think, are highly relevant to individuals entering the profession of teaching. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the growth of interest in science, about meditation and mindfulness. I'm going to speak about two large and unanswered questions that frame this research. I'm going to present to you a model of contemplative mental development that I've been working on for the last several years with my colleagues that you know. And I'll give you two examples from our research that are empirically based. But I want to begin with a personal anecdote. So in 2009 in Dharamsala, I asked you, how can we motivate individuals in a secular society to investigate their minds with the kind of intensity and commitment of Buddhist practitioners in search of liberation? And you turned to me and you said, it's up to people like you. I don't know if you remember that moment, but that moment has stayed with us these last 5 years. So that's a very high challenge. And science in and of itself, the data that we have, cannot at this point make that point to people. So, okay? So there's been an extraordinary explosion. This is the number of publications about mindfulness per year in the scientific literature. So you see, there's a real kind of extraordinary explosion. Every year there are more papers. Because there's more research doesn't mean that we actually have answers. In fact, all of this research activity promotes almost more questions. And this research has been noted in the press. I'm sure you've seen the cover of Time magazine about a little over a year ago. And recently, your friends and colleagues have written an article on the cover of Scientific American, Matthew Ricard, Antoine Lutz, Richie Davidson, about some of the neuroscience that we've uncovered in terms of studies of contemplative practice. But we have a bit of a problem. Here is an article. It says, to make a killing on Wall Street, start meditating. It says, for this bottom line says, forget peace, joy, and understanding. Like the samurai before them, traders are making a killing by meditating. So why am I showing you this? A reporter came to me based on data from the Shamatha project that shows improved visual perception. People in the stock brokers, people who trade, they want to meditate to have sharper vision so they can see what's on the screen faster to make more money. The ethical frame is not part of their interest. This is a picture from This is a picture from a movie called The Wolf of Wall Street, who got famous for selling stocks to people that were worth nothing. And we even have now a fashion industry. You could probably tell them something. This is called Best Dressed Monk, clothes for the mindful man. So clearly, the message, the deep commitments to human values that you've been representing is not always penetrating into at least our society. So this brings me to the point of what are the contexts that we need to consider for practice. So we've heard a little bit, Tom mentioned this, about the nature of neuroplasticity. But neuroplasticity really is neutral. We get good at whatever it is we do, however we do it. So even if we have poor moral values, we are an expert at poor moral values. You said in 1990, and then again in the Ann Arbor meeting in 2006, certain forms of meditation or ways of practicing can be practicing dullness. You recommend analytical meditation. And Rajan, in the next talk, will talk a little bit about the benefits of that. So we need teachers to embody the understanding and wisdom to impart why and how to practice any technique in a given contemplative exercise so that the right intention is realized. So there are two big questions I think about for scientific research. One is, what do people do when they meditate? And I'm going to argue that this is nearly an impossible question to answer scientifically. And that's because each person differs in their motivation and their attitude toward practice, in their understanding of instructions on how to meditate, on the way they implement these instructions, on what they learn from practice and when they learn it. And then we also have the physiological changes from just entertaining the posture of practice, just from changing your behavior to actually spend time meditating. And that has effects too. But there is another question that we can ask. What do people do differently because they've meditated, because they've engaged in contemplative practice? And this is tractable. This is something we can do. We can take experimental approaches and we can evaluate the effects of training. This is what you're going to hear about from Kim's talk later as well for programs with children. We can test before and after training, and if we have an appropriate control group, we can use established methods, and this is what some of the best research, that's the approach it takes. But we have a big question. What do we measure? We can't just use the tools that were developed in Western cognitive psychology and say this is going to capture the depth of transformation of the mind from what you teach. We need to understand changes in cognitive and emotional capacity, values, worldview, and very, very few studies actually look at behavior in the real world, in social life. So the bulk of what I want to talk to you about is an effort over the last few years that I've been engaged in with Amishi Jha and John Dunn and Antoine Lutz. And this is an effort to translate contemplative theory into the language of scientific psychology. So what is our intent? What are we trying to do? We're going to use a phenomenological approach, asking questions about subjective or lived experience, drawing on meditation instructions and teachings from the Buddhist tradition and current thinking in psychology and neuroscience. And this is our question. Is it possible to describe multiple dimensions of mental development that are supported by mindfulness practice? This model has to be in terms that psychologists and neuroscientists can understand and that make sense to contemplative scholars, practitioners, and teachers. But the most important thing is this model is a heuristic or a teaching device. It is non-exhaustive, provisional, subject to refinement and reconfiguration. So this is preliminary. We are not saying this is the way it is. So I'm going to show you a cube. The dimensions of this cube represent 3 core aspects of cognitive function intentionally cultivated by mindfulness practices. But they're all natural phenomena. And this model has an assumption that there's going to be a physical posture of practice that's conducive to investigating one's mind and being awake, that one approaches the practice with a sense of non-aversion, of interest. There is a pre-existing ethical framework. This is not a model of the ethical framework. And there will be a sense of a commitment to a task, to engage in the practice itself. Non-aversive emotion. A softness. Okay? So the first dimension, we call it object orientation. And object orientation simply represents the degree to which you are concentrated on an object. Pretty straightforward. But I could be very focused with my mind unwavering. Say I can be really thirsty, and if this bottle of water was in a cage and I couldn't get to it, I'd be very focused on this. So I'd be very highly object-oriented. But object-oriented also could be if you are at an airport and you're waiting for your luggage to come and you don't see your bag. You're still focused on looking for your bag. So it's not just that it's a physical object, it can be a conceptual object. And focused attention practices can cultivate this kind of concentration. The second dimension we call de-reification. And de-reification, so this is the opposite of reify. So when you see your thoughts as objects, as mental phenomena, but not as reality, you are de-reifying your thoughts. This is one of the mechanisms by which something like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy can help with depression relapse, so that when you begin to think negative thoughts, you can see it's just a tape, just a thought, not reality. The third dimension, we call this meta-awareness. And this is a little harder to describe. Meta-awareness. So, meta means about, around, about, awareness of awareness. So, if I am focused on the screen, I still have a capacity to know the room is full of people. If somebody asked me, I'm pointing to the screen and talking to you, do I feel also the pressure of my elbow on the chair? Yes. I can report about the periphery even while focused on an object. If I see a beautiful sunset, I can describe the color, but I also can report on what it feels like in my body without having to go and introspect. This is just things that are present in my awareness. But if I have very low meta-awareness, all I see is the object, and everything else in the world collapses. So these are 3 dimensions, and each point in this space has other qualities too. So the first quality is aperture. Like in a camera, you can have a narrow aperture, you can have a small opening, or a big opening that lets more light in. So if my object is a candle flame, I have a narrow aperture. If my object is the space of mental events, I have a very broad aperture. We also have a dimension of clarity. Clarity in the mind. You can be very dull. You might be on an object, but you might be very, okay, I'm there. I'm very tired. I cannot see it very vividly, but it's sort of fuzzy, but it's there. Or I can be very clear and sharp and vivid. We also have a dimension of stability. And as you train your mind, you may be much more stable. And so stability means, what is the probability that the next moment finds you in the same place in the model? And finally, a sense of effort. How hard is it to do the practice? If I'm a novice, I'm a beginner, and I'm supposed to sit down and watch my breath, and I'm not used to that, it feels very difficult. So I need to put a lot of effort in. If I'm an expert, you just settle in, and it's effortless. So this space now, we can actually map mental states and practices into this space. So a moment of addictive craving, I would say that it's very highly object-oriented, but if I'm really strongly desiring an object, then I have low de-reification. That object is very real. I take it as having absolutely inherent existence. So, do I have a lot of meta-awareness? Am I aware of the periphery? If I have a craving for my drug, whatever it is? No. So we have high object orientation, narrow aperture. It could be very vivid, but it's reified and low meta-awareness. And I can put other mental states, mind wandering over here, very unstable, sort of moderate clarity. When your mind going every which way, you're very distracted. So it's low stability, low effort. It's not really centered on any one particular object. So it's sort of in this location on object orientation. But again, you have low meta-awareness. But let's say I have rumination. I have a train of very persistent thoughts I can't get out of my mind. Then this is where we put rumination. We have a little more effort because you wish the rumination to stop. You are aware of rumination, so you have meta-awareness. So we can put meditative practices on this space. So this here is focused attention, say mindfulness of breathing, for a novice. And there's a high degree of effort because that's the high effort, and it's fairly object focused, so it's up here. And because you're really engaging in the practice, there's some degree of de-reification. There's not high stability, you lose the object frequently, so it's unstable and not so clear. But an expert, now you have much more meta-awareness, more de-reification, less effort, more clarity. And we can put open monitoring or non-dual practices or open presence practices where you have very low object orientation, but the main focus is the field of the unfolding of experience. So you have high meta-awareness, high clarity, low effort for the expert over here, and less of that for the novice. What this model lets you do is to consider how people move with practice in this space and how you can describe both the dimensions in terms of naturally occurring states and specific practices. So this is its utility. We can map expected outcomes of various processes. We can motivate the development of experimental designs and tasks relevant to each of these 7 dimensions. We can visualize individual trajectories of development where people move in this space with practice, or individual differences at the same amount of training. We can potentially locate what I call no-fly zones, where people can get into psychological trouble. If you have very high meta-awareness, but very low de-reification, you become very aware of your internal processes, and all of a sudden you begin to not know where you are, and you feel like you're depersonalizing, you're losing any sense of self. And sometimes people get into psychological trouble. They have high anxiety. And of course, we want to inspire further discussion of what we've left out of the model. So that's this model, Your Holiness. So in the next part of my talk, unless you have any comments at this point, any comments?
So yesterday, we usually talk also about this making distinction between the conceptual thoughts and non-conceptual states of mind. Mm-hmm. No.
I think since a number of years, I just sort of express or suggestion at our meeting. In some cases, I think number of cases, I feel it may be quite easy is to make a distinction when sensorial sort of consciousness more active, simultaneously, is a mental awareness, but totally relying on sensorial experience. That's one level. Mm-hmm. At that moment, yigi shebe tongyoda, migi shebe tongsade, yawachido marwa. 지단 소소 소에 타네. 따이네. 따지네. Then close your eye. Then sensorial sort of consciousness now no longer active. So only now picture of that. That is iluganto dedo.
Yes. So usually when we look at something with our eyes open, we see the thing with our visual perception, and together with it also the mental consciousness also performs its function to see the object as well. But in a way we are not able to make the distinction right away, by using our own awareness. But when you close your eyes, then you can see clearly that the perceptions, the sensory perception is no more working, the visual perception is no more working, but then you still have the image of the object in your mind. At that point, the mental consciousness is active and not the sensory one.
So this is very interesting because from a neuroscientific point of view, the sustaining of neural activity in the same brain structures that were responsible...
Same brain.
Same brain structures.
That I'm wondering.
Well, they won't be exactly the same. But in large part, there are many studies that show that when you imagine an object, you have activation in visual cortex. And so there is a decay of that activity. And sometimes if you keep the object in your mind alive, you will be reinstantiating, you will be maintaining activity in visual areas. But visual areas are all, the whole brain is involved. But there is this activation in the sensory cortex when you imagine. Many studies
So now
have shown
here
this.
it's quite clear. Animal, as far as sensorial sort of consciousness, or I don't know, the knowing, right? Knower, sensorial level, I think some animal much stronger than we human being.
They certainly have perceptual capacity
But there
that can exceed us.
Very little sort of ability to judge. Making judge. Now, for example, see one object, sensorial. Then immediately, I saw that yesterday. Then mental level, not sensory level.
But you have a sense of familiarity in animals. They won't be able to articulate it in words, but they will know.
Now here,
a feeling tone.
You see, we, Buddhist psychology or something, you see, mentioned the sensorial sort of seeing or awareness is the present one, not seeing the actually object which we feel we saw yesterday, but actually the object, yesterday's object, gone.
That's right.
New object, now sensory level. The
So the sensorial perception, sensory perceptions, what they do is they're able to see what is present, what the object that is present in its vision. That much they can see.
Now, mental level, when you remember, I saw this yesterday, that tunji tonto naosayati.
So when you have this
that particular
memory,
term there, I don't know how to translate it into English. I don't know.
So there is this, when you have a memory of something that has happened yesterday, what actually happens is you have some kind of an image of the object, which maybe in the Western terminology, in the philosophy, you use something like representation of an object. It's not that, it's just that thing that is taken as the object by the memory, and then you remember.
So this
So 도미 시에 아니 그게 크도 캬버 가리오를 통된게 진짜네 유주 정신 만져봤어야 돼. 똑바로야 튼지 튼도 나인 줄잖아. 유주 정신 되었어야 돼.
So,
I wish I could.
You see, then it is necessary you spend at least a few years for study Tibetan.
Yes, I know.
So, difficult.
so with regard to the sensory perceptions,
Then your age should make younger, then more possibility to study these things. Oh. Translate. Tomi digi kudu kyabra kariyabadi tong. Yesterday de tungumidwa wa. Ko gasarwa. Kudu kyabra kariyabadi. Sa didi iluzane ko yu manjeba, tu manjeba, rengshin manjeba. Kudu kor tong de wa. Da tokala tunji todo na iluzane o kasa tong su iluzane tu jeba. Ani di in 그래서 현다실에 통수를 전에 유제와 아니 통제 뭐고 거라 뭐 가가라 레디다 카세디다 될 통수 전에 뭐 제대와 저상가 유투 정신 만지버치네 크두기 뭐부터 통된게도 오미시버치 도미시버치 똑발이야 뒤지 돈나인도 전에 이 유정신 대사디
So, with regard to the sensory
저상
perceptions,
똑바로 도미기 켜버쳐야 돼 개셔버셔야 돼.
the point here is that I would like to make is to be able to make this clear distinction between conceptual thoughts and non-conceptual mind, states of mind. And so with regard to the non-conceptual mind, such as the sensory perceptions, what happens is what is presented to the perception is seen at that moment. And also, here there are three dimensions, which is like the object. The object it sees is not mixed with others. I mean, the perception is not mixed up with regard to the object, nor the time at which it sees the object is mixed up, and nor the nature or the ontological object is mixed. But with regard to the conceptual thought, what happens is you are, in a way, there is a kind of a mix-up between, in the object itself. What was seen yesterday, you still think that you are seeing that today. And similarly with regard to time and the other dimension.
So training is actually mental level,
Yes.
not sensory level.
But there are sensory consequences. Vividness.
그래서 that's why I don't think you see the blind person. So that moment you see sensory, the eye sort of consciousness no function, no longer there.
Yeah.
But then the mental level, color, shape, all this could be very clear. I think when I was in Lhasa, one sweeper, one eye.
Yeah.
His one eye is much sort of stronger, sharp than two eyes. I felt it's one eye, the mental sort of consciousness, I think fully focusing on that. Two eye is seeing more things.
So I have a picture on another talk of a beautiful painting by a blind artist who has no eyes, who can paint
So all
with
this is
perspective.
carry with mental level, right?
No.
Mental. So I think you see it is maybe I think useful to make clear distinction, sensory level awareness and mental level awareness. Then all this training is mental level.
So this meta-awareness dimension,
The organs now glass is much helpful than meditation. The mental level meditation is much more powerful than the glass. So I think it is quite useful to make distinction. That my feeling.
so this dimension of meta-awareness, in the way we think about it, actually captures a lot of what you were talking about being able to distinguish the thing in the moment and the sense of familiarity and the memory and the conceptual designation of it. All of that can appear in the mind in a non-conceptual sense of awareness. I can become aware as objects scattered about of my conceptual thought. So there is a compatibility with what you're talking about in this sense of meta-awareness, but it is obviously not distinguishing these specific elements, but it has a quality of overlap.
用作恰常通吧，
No.
是吧？这个
So, I am almost out of time. So, I haven't talked at all about data, but the data that I have, you have already seen, although this audience hasn't. So, I beg the chair for 5 minutes, or maybe, or not. 5 minutes.
exactly 5.
Exactly 5. Well, I have a clock right here. So I just want to go right to the most relevant thing, I think, for compassion. So we created this Shamatha project, which had 2 3-month retreats, full-time retreats that Alan Wallace taught. And the focus of the training was focused attention, shamatha meditation, for instance, mindfulness of breathing. And he promoted attitudes of loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. And we have done follow-up testing for this training, 5 months, a year and a half, and now 6 to 7 year follow-up. We're still testing. And we have many assessments, and we have an extraordinary group of individuals who've been part of this. And this work has been funded most recently by the John Templeton Foundation in honor of you winning the Templeton Prize. So we had this meditation lodge, and in the lodge we built laboratories, and we expect people to improve their ability to focus and sustain attention, the ability to withhold inappropriate responses, and the ability to engage with suffering when it arises in self and others, and hopefully to be more pro-social. So I'm going to skip this piece because I don't have time, but in terms of emotion, we expect this kind of intensive training to decrease the way you push away the experience of suffering. People will have less anger, contempt, and disgust when they perceive suffering, and perhaps more sadness. So we did an experiment where and you've seen this movie, I'm not going to show the movie, just a couple of pictures. We look at people's facial expression of emotion while they view a movie. And these are some graphic images. This was a documentary about the Iraq War. And here's someone looking very sad while they see an injured boy, or a girl who has had napalm on her face. And here is a soldier, a US soldier, speaking about how difficult it was and his remorse. And then we code facial expressions using Paul Ekman's facial action coding. I will talk to you at lunch about Paul. And what we'd find is that before the retreat, the control group, which is a group that's going to go on and do the same retreat later, they don't differ in how likely they are to show sadness or how often they show sadness. They're the same at the beginning. But after training, the retreat group is much more likely to show sadness. If we talk about this anger, contempt, and disgust, there's no difference before the retreats. In the control group, this is not a significant difference in either the probability of showing these emotions or their number. But after training, there's a significant decrease in the number of anger, contempt, and disgust expressions. So what that means is that even though they're equally probable to occur, there's fewer of them. So you can actually use, we think, the awareness of anger arising in the mind to catalyze relaxing from it, and to de-reify that, and to re-engage. And I have 18 seconds, so I will just tell you at the end of the deal what we find. And we find that if you ask people what they feel when they show sadness, they don't say, "I'm sad." They say, "I'm feeling sympathy." So we code what we think is sadness, but we think really it's a marker of other-directed empathic concern. And these results are just now, finally, after many years, in press in the journal Emotion. So we'll be able to send you in your office the paper when it
So
comes
if
out.
possible, another 1 or 2 more minutes, if possible.
Well, you said exactly 5.
Now,
So-
second thought.
Second thought. Okay.
That means, you see, mental mind always very active.
Oh, no doubt, no doubt. So to reiterate this, the way we did what I'm just describing to you is after people saw these films, we showed them a storyboard, and they were able to tell us what emotions they were feeling at different points in the film. So they actually could say, okay, when this guy started talking, I felt disgust because he was saying how happy he was getting when he was going to kill the enemy. This is part of what he was saying. So we have a rating that people gave us. And we were able to say, what did people say when we coded they show sadness? And when we looked at the self-report that occurred close in time after training in the retreatants, in the meditators, they didn't say they were sad. They said they had higher sympathy and distress. But they weren't sad. In the control group, there was no relation between when they said sad, they looked sad, and they didn't say they were sympathetic. So these findings throw into question the meaning of the sadness expressions. They may be markers of training-related growth of other-directed empathic concern. So this kind of training can create a qualitative change in everyday perceptions of suffering, which can facilitate the arising of compassion when confronted with suffering in yourself and others. And that's it.
Here I have one question. Now, for example,
Yeah?
physical pain. The person, you see, thinking, you see, some other sort of, through training of mind, you see, their suffering is something useful. So, mental level, consider that physical suffering, particular one suffering, is consider something useful, so brings some satisfaction. Another one, oh, how bad this suffering. So, actual rate of suffering physical, any change or not?
Well, there's a lot of data on this in the mindfulness-based stress reduction for treatment of chronic pain. And what people report is they have less of this attitude. Oh, how terrible, this will never go away. They are able to de-reify the thoughts that make the suffering worse, but they report the same physical sensation. But the same physical sensation does not mean suffering.
Yes. Clear.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Seren. It was indeed a very, very fascinating talk. And what I feel is that the model that you are propagating, you are suggesting right now, it is a model which does go deeper into the contemplative process. And particularly the dimensions that you've talked about, aperture, clarity, stability, and effort. I think it goes to define all the different aspects of contemplative practices, and in due course of time, giving rise to compassion. It's a beautiful model, and I'm sure Your Holiness, your remarks, your comments, and your insights into the model will go a long way in understanding the model and putting it into practice. Particularly the aspect that you talked about, the distinction between sensory experience and the perceptual experience. We as psychologists always make a distinction. The mental representations are the most important ones. The mental representations are very, very important, which we carry with us. And they are primarily based upon memory processes. They are stored in our brain, and we are utilizing them every now and then. And that's what is involved in the process of meditation, and contemplative practices of any kind. Thank you so much for giving us this wonderful insight, and thank you very much, Your Holiness, for providing us further insight into issues of these kinds. Since we have indulged in a dialogue with Your Holiness, I would still think that we have a little time for some questions from the audience. Yes, please, take the mic, please.
I wonder, my question has two parts. I wonder whether His Holiness wanted to refer to the distinction between Nirvikalpa Pratyaksha and Savikalpa Pratyaksha. And second part is, does he advocate...
Hold on, no, he's asking, he's getting questions.
Yeah, okay.
He's getting translation.
And may I also the second part, because it can be answered in one answer. The answer may be one. And the second part is, does His Holiness recommend the practice in meditation of Nirvikalpa Pratyaksha? That's how I understood the conversation with Dr. Saran. Do you recommend that you look at an object, say light on a tree, and without meditation? That's the second part of the question. As part of the meditation practice.
Did you understand?
May I say?
Do you recommend focus?
Sensation.
Focusing on the light without looking at it as an object.
No, looking at something, say the way light falls on a bush or a tree, and looking at it without the mentation, just pure sensation.
이루다 만들어 원비시벨려가 배실 야야비시 아이 거를 시베 못이야 거를 이루다 넣어요. 맞죠? 그래. 원비시가 카상기 이루다 만들어 원비시벨려가 제가 아이. 저다가 원비시가 세리 원 빼는 미기시. 빼는 미시도 차시하나? 그 문지 미시도 차시하나? 유원부디 미긴체 미기 원부디기 다긴체 딱그 세리 몰게 돼야지 테마타기 다 시바다 딩은기 딱 간다 뜻만 넣으면 이루고 컨티뉴스리 넣어대고 그러봐 그래서 이루되다 만들지 원비 시바 배치 가고 있어.
So it may be quite difficult to have mere, what you're saying is perception, without any thought processes going on in it, because the
thought is very. I think that this word, creates some complication. That was all. The mental slow.
No.
You.
Mental.
Thought, I don't know.
No. So.
Then I need for further sort of. I mean, one English class in Oxford, not in America, but Oxford, to learn exactly each of these words' meaning. I don't know. So in any way, labda.
So when we see something, for example, there is an object that we see, and then also when you have the sensory perception or some cognition about it, and then there is also what we call the empowering faculty or condition, which is like the sense organ, for example. And then there is
당연히 견숨 쓰도
now.
견숨 시바키야.
Now, so here we are actually relating what are known as the three different conditions that actually produce sensory consciousness, for example. So the third condition is known as the immediately preceding consciousness, which is actually the
mental
mental
consciousness continuously. So that's the basis. A certain thing develop as a cognitive. So eye consciousness also is cognitive, is aware the thing. So that part, because of the mental continuation, continuum.
Continuation now.
Oh. So without that, you see,
So without this third condition, the mental faculty, which actually gives rise to the cognitive nature of the sense perception, you cannot have that sense perception as well.
Here is one example. One example, you see, it stated when we usually call sixth mind, the main mind, mental way,
No.
mental mind, and eye consciousness, seeing something.
It can.
Meantime, hearing some, some sound. Then, when the mental mind fully sort of absorbed sound, then a moment I see, eye consciousness seeing stop.
Yes. Maybe we can do that later. Yeah, please. Thank you. And we can have one or two more questions, please. And I would request you to kindly make them precise. Yeah, the next question I would like from one of the students.
Thanks, Clifford. It was really wonderful to listen to you. I have one clarification to seek. What was the duration that the time that you gave to each of the meditators in your experiment? Because I'm asking
The time
question.
duration of each of the...
Meditators. In your project, there were
Yes.
the meditators, so you were measuring, taking the measurement.
Yes.
What was the time given? Was it 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours? What was the duration?
Of meditation?
That is right.
About
And-
600 hours.
No, I'm asking in one individual sitting.
One session.
One session.
Oh, it changed. It was individual. It began as 24-minute gatikas in the traditional Tibetan style of shamatha practice. And as individuals changed their capacity to sit still,
Okay.
they added another 24 minutes and another 24 minutes. And they did that on an individual subject basis
Okay.
in consultation with the teacher.
Okay.
What we have are logs from every day. They wrote down the time of each session and what they practiced
Okay.
in terms of the way they could describe it.
Right.
So for some people, the average was 6 hours a day of shamatha practices and about 45 minutes of four immeasurables.
Okay.
That's on average. But some people could sit for 3 hours, other people sat for 20 minutes, took a break, sat another 20 minutes.
Okay. So one gatika. So I really want to make a distinction here. One is sitting for, as you said, maybe 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. But actually, when you are really taking the shamatha state of that mind, which means totally focused, let us say in your case on the breathing, what was the duration which was totally uninterrupted? That's a really mind in shamatha. So one is the physical posture, and another one is the mind in meditation.
So that's a really interesting question. we have not ever looked at the aggregate timing. We only have looked at daily total.
Okay.
So it would be very interesting for us to go back and investigate individual performance where they actually grow continuous capacity to be seated.
Yes. Because some of the classic texts says, like for instance, Vivekananda, he said that it is less than 2 hours, it is no meditation.
Well,
One of the texts in Shiva Samhita says that it should be 420 minutes. His Holiness book, How to Practice, it said that it should be at least 4 hours. So I don't know whether that's really the perspective that you're going to have.
there have been
Thank you.
many studies that show that even a simple instruction to change the way you perceive, pay attention to your body, has effects that we can measure. Very short duration effects are reported in the scientific literature, and it will not be possible in our culture to have people meditate 2 hours and say that anything less than that is not meditation. That's not happening.
Thank you, Dr. Seren. I think the question asked just now is of great importance if you are doing the outcome studies. Because the duration of meditation and what goes on in the first hour and the last hour of meditation is very important to be investigated. The last question, quick question from any of the students? Yeah, please.
We do respect His Holiness. And
Hold on, he's
we do respect His Holiness and other professor. While I was looking at the graph you mentioned over in the here while you talk, I was wondering. I got the point like the more the meta awareness the person have, does it really mean that the more meta awareness the person have, the better mindfulness the person he has?
No.
No? And also wondering.
Well, I can elaborate on that.
One more. Does it also mean that I was wondering, the more short-tempered the person is, the less meta-awareness the person could be? Because that ignorance for the short temper, while we in the level of the temper, we often become ignorant. We often don't know what's happening. Because the meta-awareness is more like, we see something, but we feel something. We see the object over here, but we also know that we feel the object, the pressurized over here also. That's the meta-awareness, right?
So the model is moments in time. And so you have to think about it in terms of what physicists talk about. This is a state-space model. So the moment of acute anger might have very low meta-awareness, but simultaneously a person they often say, I could not control myself. They may have high awareness of the process as it unfolds, and they do the wrong thing. They're sort of unable to inhibit the response, but they may be very clear on what's happening. That doesn't mean that the capacity to inhibit what's happening is present. So when we talk about mindfulness, mindfulness is the dynamic interaction of all of these dimensions situated in this larger context. Mindfulness is not equal to any one dimension. And the moment of an emotion or the rising of strong anger could collapse your awareness of everything else. You have low momentary meta-awareness. And
Thank
Paul, and we could talk about that.
Thank you so much. I know we could go on with the discussion, and it's a very interesting model. And just last thing that I would like to say on this, I think what Cliff, you explained about the novice and the expert, the answer lies there. Yes. Where when you start the process of meditation as a novice, and when you reach a higher state of consciousness as an expert, meditating for days together, for months together, for years together, I think that's where you develop the best of meta-awareness. And that's the key to what His Holiness has yesterday talked about and has been talking about, reducing the intensity of your negative emotions, your disgust, anger, and so on.
Right.
Thank you very much for a very, very interesting session which involved, I think, most of you. And now the paucity of time suggests that we should really move fast. So our next speaker, the very distinguished speaker that we have, is Mr. Rajan K.G. Chendi, who's sitting here with us. And he's going to speak on reasoning in meditation, educating the mind. That's another dimension which Mr. Chendi is going to add to it. Let me just give a brief background to Mr. Rajan. He has been, he studied physics and law and has been involved a lot in field training, field visits and so on, rural areas and so on. That is what he did in his early years. And later on, he moved, as he came from abroad, he moved down to Rishi Valley School, and now he's seriously engaged in Buddhism and in parallel J. Krishnamurti. And this is what he's going to present to us, the thoughts on J. Krishnamurti and the parallelism with Buddhism. So, Mr. Chendi.
I want to share one thing. The object meditate or concentrate also make differences. External object or mind itself take as an object. Then as a meditate, mind itself. That the shedan the deja the jik desu jadi shebe jik indusane di pejir ngözin di ke da chilo da gong'e shebe yule mikwa membeche so sheba kora mikdin shane samta da di pejir kejum desun. Tigan buju ji timasune.
So I feel it's important to focus, to do meditation, focusing on your mind itself, taking the mind itself as your, object of focus rather than any other external object. For example, when we go through these emotions, such as anger and attachment and so forth, and so it's more important to focus on the mind itself, taking the mind as the object.
That case is not necessarily, you see,
Focusing.
I don't know, not a single pointed concentrate, but simply watching the mind. Now, I experience this kind of thought. Then that thought itself, you see, something is momentarily changing. So just purely watching that. The ability to know the mind then clear.
That was one of the practices that Alan taught. That's part of what our practitioners did.
Your Holiness, Dr. Ashum Gupta, esteemed colleagues, and all friends, I'm deeply privileged to be able to give this talk, and seriously speaking, I don't know why I deserve to be given this privilege, since I'm not an academic and I'm not doing any research. But anyway, I'm very thankful to Dr. Meenakshi Thapan for inviting me to give this presentation. I'm going to talk, as I said, on reasoning in meditation and educating the mind. So my talk is in two parts. The first part... it's with some trepidation that I give the first part, because what I'm going to say in the first part is basically what I've learned from Your Holiness and other teachers from within the tradition. So it's a bit like carrying coals to Newcastle. And but anyway, the rest of the audience may not be familiar with this, therefore I will include the first part and then focus on the second. Now, there's a widespread belief in New Age circles, but also in Buddhist, Hindu, and Krishnamurti circles, that meditation is a process of emptying the mind of all thought. That thought is actually a hindrance to meditation, and your meditation is successful when your mind is free of thoughts, and that basically is a meditative state. I'm not going to directly argue with this position. I'm just going to point out that there is another very central tradition, both in Hinduism and Buddhism, in which reasoning plays, or thought processes, reasoning plays a central or crucial part in meditation. And this is the triad of hearing, reflecting, and meditating, which is there both in the Hindu and the Buddhist tradition. So I'll elaborate briefly on this. What do we mean by hearing? To hear something is to first come across an idea or set of ideas from an authentic teacher. An authentic teacher is one who actually lives these ideas. He doesn't just talk about them, but he has realized them, he's lived them. He himself has heard them from an authentic teacher. And so generally in the tradition, they trace this lineage back to the founder of the lineage. In the case of the Buddhists, it's always the Buddha, Lord Buddha himself. In the case of different Hindu sampradayas, they have different founders of different traditions. But this element of hearing is when a person first comes across an idea or a perspective, and causes an initial awakening in the mind. Now, I would just take an example. Supposing my teacher is teaching me about the faults of self-cherishing, being self-centered. He may begin by pointing out to me the fundamental equality or sameness between myself and all other beings. Now, why do we say that fundamentally all of us here in the room are? Fundamentally, all of us in this room are basically the same. It is because, as His Holiness pointed out yesterday, there is absolutely no difference in that each one of us wants happiness. And we don't just want fleeting happiness, we want an enduring form of happiness. And conversely, none of us want suffering. And we shy away even from the mildest form of suffering, a mild headache, for example. So at this level, if we look at all of us in this room or in the world or in many worlds, we see there is no fundamental difference between any of us. So the question arises, I mean, this may look trivial, but actually if you look at our own behavior, our own day-to-day this thing, we'll see we are always privileging ourselves, our happiness, and putting the happiness of others aside. So though this may look like a trivial statement, intellectually it may not appear very deep, but existentially it's extremely profound to live according to this. Now, when the teacher points this out, he may also point out, therefore your normal behavior, the way you're living your life, where you're always privileging yourself and being either indifferent or antagonistic to other people's happiness, is fundamentally flawed. At which point you might object and say, look, my happiness is my concern, his happiness is his concern. Why should I be bothered about his happiness? At which point the teacher would teach you the faults of what is called self-cherishing. Now, I don't have time to go into all the arguments or reasonings, But very briefly, he may point out to you, he might say, look at a family in which the father, the head of the household, is only thinking of himself all the time. He's using all the resources of the family for his own pleasures. He is even disappropriating his wife and children for the sake of pursuing his own pleasures. Now, he may ask you, if there's a family like this, what is likely to be the situation in this family? Is there likely to be happiness in such a family? Is the father himself likely to find the kind of happiness that he is pursuing? Or will the negative feelings that emerge in such a family actually cloud his own happiness? Or he may give you another example, which is that if you look at a housing block or a housing colony, and you look at one family which is trying to grab as much of the common resources as possible for itself, what is the possible reaction and the situation in that? So in this way, this is just an example, I can't dwell on it, he may introduce you to many ways of looking at things, many lines of reasoning, which show you the dangers of self-cherishing, that self-cherishing actually leads to the opposite from what you actually want to achieve, which is happiness. Okay? So now you have heard this teaching, and you've heard it, something has awakened in you, you begin to take it seriously. The second step in the triad is you go away quietly by yourself and you think it over, you contemplate, you mull over these reasons again and again. And when you mull them over, you don't just mull them over theoretically, you look at your own life. And this is crucial. You have to look at your own life in the light of this teaching. And you have to become aware of all the moments of the day, the week, in which you are actually indulging in self-cherishing and what is arising out of that self-cherishing behavior. I cut a cue. What happens? How do the other people react? How do I react to them? Okay? So you're taking everyday situations and mulling it over, but you're also questioning. And this is very important, because you may have doubts. You will have the doubts, supposing don't protect myself, then who will protect me? Other people will take advantage of me. So you have to examine this doubt. You check with your teacher, with other students. You get into a discussion, either with them or internally, mentally about it, and you try to resolve the doubts. The Lord Buddha, from whom this teaching comes, said that don't take my teachings on faith. Examine them like a goldsmith would examine gold. A goldsmith melts gold, he beats it, he washes it again and again to purify it. Likewise, look at my teachings and see if they are valid. So the second part, this process of contemplation, is this process by which the student goes and thinks about this again and again from many different angles, discusses it, till he develops a certain conviction about the teaching. Once he develops this conviction, then the third phase of meditating on this teaching arises. Now, in the process of meditation, he may again invoke the blessings of his teacher to remove those impediments which are preventing him from fully realizing the teaching. Now, in the meditation, the process of reasoning is very condensed, because he's very familiar with these ideas. He's looked at them in different ways. Now, a very small trigger can bring the whole process of reasoning in a flash into his mind. And then he may reach a stage in the process of meditation where he actually sees this. It's almost like, I would say, a visual perception or a direct perception. Though it's mental, it has that quality of immediacy. When he has reached this stage of actually seeing through the process of meditation, that is what brings about a basic or fundamental transformation of the mind, in this respect at least. His perspective in life has shifted. Okay. Now, in this process, this triad, which as I said is common to both Buddhist and Hindu traditions, reasoning has played a crucial role at all three stages. In the third stage, it's more hidden, but the ability to see the truth of something is dependent or contingent on this process of reasoning having been gone through. Therefore, I want to assert that far from being a hindrance to meditation, reasoning is actually crucial to many forms of meditation. There may be other types of meditation where it is not, but much of our meditative practice is based on reasoning. Secondly, if you actually look at it, it's not as if this is some esoteric thing done only by disciples sitting in the Himalayas or something like this. Yeah? Reasoning is something which is functioning in our everyday lives. I'll give you an example. Supposing somebody says something which upsets you. Now you hear it. And then you go away, and that scene repeats in your mind. He said this to me. Why did he say this? How could he have said this? Actually, I am the person who always does things correctly. How can he say that I am not honest? Okay, so in your mind, that is playing. And then it goes further. Actually, he is not an honest person. He is a bad person. Okay, look at the people he associates with. So your mind spins a whole narrative around this small incident. And this narrative goes on and on repeating in your mind. You get up in the middle of the night and these thoughts come into your mind. Okay, this is a process of reasoning. In a sense, it's a process of meditating, but it's incorrect reasoning. The reasoning is not based on valid knowledge. Now, why this is so is something I can't go, why it's incorrect, but I think you can already see why this process of reasoning is incorrect. So all our emotions are actually shot through with reasoning. Sometimes, because the reasoning process has gone on for so long, when you see some person, instantly there's dislike, and you react. At that moment, the reasons don't come to your mind, but they have been played out. So one could say that practically all emotions that we experience in life are contingent on reasoning. And therefore, it becomes very important to develop correct ways of reasoning, correct modes of reasoning. And with this, I'll move to the second part of my talk, which is about educating the mind. Which is about educating the mind and deals more with my own classroom experience. How in a classroom, incorrect reasoning can be called into question, how modes of correct reasoning can be developed. You see, briefly, I teach economics. Why do I teach economics? Not because I've done economics, as the chairperson said. I've done physics, law. I studied philosophy in Germany. But I had, for about 12 years of my life, from late 60s to the end of the 70s, I was an activist, a political activist working in villages and slums and with industrial workers. And I learned a lot of economics in the grassroots. And then I began to read on my own and picked up the subject. So I moved away from political activism because of a lot of questions I had in my mind. And I went to Germany. I studied philosophy there at the University of Heidelberg for 7 years. But I came back without completing a doctorate. And now I'm in Rishi Valley School. I'm teaching economics. So with my students, I attempt to raise questions. And I'll give you one example. There's not enough time to expand on it. But it's a central example, the question of development, which has been coming up in some of the talks earlier. Now, in economics or in current theory, development is seen as a growing production and consumption of ever better and better goods and services. So both elements, the increased quantity of consumption and better quality of consumption. So this is what development is defined by. And now one can raise the question, there is an assumption here that the more you consume, the happier you will be. Obviously, this is a highly questionable assumption, but I'm not going to take that up here. I'm going to take the definition as it is and show you why this idea of development is completely incoherent. Now, if it's increased consumption of goods and services, let's take America, which is a highly developed country. Now, in America, each family has an average of 1 to 2 cars. And the car has become a symbol of freedom, personal mobility, and so on. Now, supposing India was to become developed like America, we have a population of about 1.2 billion right now. Supposing we had only 1 car per family, forget about 2, 1 car per family, then it would mean that we have something like 250 million cars on our roads. Now just think of this in terms of its consequence. Think of the road maintenance. Think of the waste generated by the cars which are junked. Think of the raw materials required to produce this volume of cars. Think of the pollution, global warming. And finally think of, which you can easily do living in Delhi, the traffic jams. So what does it mean? You see, this is the promise held out by development. All countries, all families, all peoples will become developed. They'll become more and more like the West. They will have the same level of material goodies that the West has, or America has. What does this mean? Is it possible? Evidently, it's not. It's never going to happen. Which means what? It means some people, some countries, some people in those countries, some people in other countries will have all these things and others won't. But the other people have been held out this promise. And therefore, they are aspiring towards this. And since they can never attain it, and this is not a small minority, it is a majority. Of the global population, it's a majority in countries like Asia, Africa, Latin America, and so on. The majority of the population will never become developed. They'll remain underdeveloped. They will be what are called in modern jargon, losers. People who have not made it. You see, development has taken the dimensions of a quasi-eschatological vision of the world. Christianity has gone out of Europe. Heaven has gone out. Now what we have is development. Therefore, it has a powerful grip on the minds of people, including ordinary people, and they all want to do this. In contrast, if you look at, for example, India or any pre-modern civilization, ownership of goods, wealth, and so on had a role, a place, but it was never predominant. Why, for example, do kings prostrate before the Buddha? Because in pre-modern times, it was clear that knowledge is more important than wealth or power. In modern times, there was a conflict, those of you who know this, in Tamil Nadu, when Jayalalitha was the chief minister at that time, was to visit the Shankaracharya, who is a great realized person, and she demanded that she sit on a higher seat and he sit on a lower seat, and his disciples said, no way, meeting didn't happen. Okay, but the fact that she could demand something like that already shows a shift in thinking in India. So this is one aspect. Psychologically, it's going to leave a large section of the world's population in a state of being losers. But it's not only psychologically that they're going to be affected. You see, when we develop in this way, this development is not neutral in terms of resources. If we use aluminum, for example, to take another example, in everything, so many things, in packing food, in biscuit packing, or whatever it is, in all your computers, etc., etc. So there's a big demand for aluminum in the world. Now this aluminum comes from bauxite mining. I recently, beginning of this term, I had gone with my class to some tribal areas in Andhra, where bauxite mining is coming up. And the people, this bauxite mining comes up, tens of thousands of tribal families will lose access to their livelihoods. The forest will be destroyed. They are dependent on the forest. So when you say that aluminum is an important resource, it's not neutral. You are saying it is an important resource, the forest is not an important resource. In the same area in the Godavari district, there's a dam coming up called the Polavaram Dam, which is going to provide water for the industrial belt of Andhra and so on. But again, we visit a village which will be submerged. And that area is home to enormous biodiversity, a natural park. So what happens to these people who, through the process of development, lose their resource base, their livelihood? They end up in cities or semi-urban areas as environmental refugees. And they are not able to get jobs. Money compensation, when it's given to them, I don't go into the details, never works. So they'll end up as environmental refugees. And what is happening with these millions now all over the world who are becoming environmental refugees because of the pattern of development? They are the ones who are feeding into the ranks of the most extreme fundamentalist groups. The IS, for example, is recruiting from these people. Entire lakes have dried up because of this pattern of development in Africa. The people who are displaced from there are joining the IS. So this is analogous to the father who tries to grab all the resources for himself. He creates a situation where his own happiness is at stake. So this pattern of development is creating a resistance of a very violent kind all across the world. And therefore, it is threatening the very happiness that these people are seeking, Now, you may say that all this is good, and that's what economists say, yeah, all this is true, but we will create new jobs, and therefore, it's okay. Now, I want to very briefly point out that new jobs are not being created. There is now even an economic jargon, 2 words, jobless growth. And the second one is we should have inclusive growth, which the IMF chief who came recently very kindly told us, India should have inclusive growth. But this growth cannot be inclusive. If you study it, and as I said, teach economics, you will see that what's called the non-formal sector of the Indian economy has been growing. 93% of our population is dependent on the informal sector. The informal sector are people like vegetable vendors, small workers here, they're somehow eking out an existence. When at all they are related to the formal sector, they are highly exploited. One source tells us that the chikan embroidery, some of you girls may be wearing it, okay, these kurtas, which are valued at 500 to 700 rupees on the market, and whose value is primarily because of the embroidery. The women who do the embroidery are paid 1 rupee per kurta. Now, I myself was stunned when I saw the statistic. I said, it can't be true. Maybe it's 10 rupees, I don't know. Yeah? But they are exploited phenomenally. So we are having a pattern of development which is not sustainable. It's not sustainable socially, it's not sustainable environmentally. And why is it not sustainable? The deepest reason is that because it's a pattern based on self-cherishing. The modern market economy has made self-cherishing, self-promotion into the its core religious value. It has become like a religion, and the core value is self-cherishing, self-protection, and this is leading to a completely unsustainable situation. So I gave this example in a little more detail because it's something which involves all of us. We are all implicated on it. Here the teacher doesn't sit on a pedestal. I am equally implicated in this pattern of consumption and production as my students. So we are looking together, is there an alternative? There's no time here to discuss alternatives, but is there an alternative? And it's crucial for this coming generation to find alternatives because time is running out. Now this process of reasoning which goes on in the classroom intensely, it's not that always we reach this level of intensity, but we do from time to time, raises questions in people's mind. And they begin to think about it. So analogous to the process of reasoning in meditation, you have a process of reasoning in the classroom, which is fundamental, I believe, and which has to be deepened and promoted if the world is to find solutions to its problems. So I have nothing against the other forms of meditation. There are other forms which don't rely so heavily on reasoning. They have their place, they are very important, they are complementary, but it would be a very big mistake not to see the importance of reasoning in our lives, and therefore not to cultivate very rigorous reasoning in ourselves. And education is a process by which we begin to see the incorrect reasonings which are guiding our lives and begin to develop correct forms of reasoning. Both these go hand in hand. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, is it? Yeah. Thank you so much for the talk, highlighting the patterns of development, what we are seeing in our present-day society. We know that we are developing, and yet we are not developing. And of course, you very rightly pointed out that self-cherishing is not a good thing in life. We have to be concerned about the happiness of others. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama has always been talking about how to be happy, how to cultivate compassion, how to develop loving kindness, which are very important to live in this present society without many conflicts. So we'll have a little time for questions. So maybe just go ahead. Anybody who would like to ask question from the audience? And Your Holiness, if you would like to give your comments.
I think you emphasize using reasons. So that I think we call analytical meditation.
Yeah.
It's a meditation. It is kind of meditation because your mind focusing that particular sort of point, but not single-pointed sort of meditation. So now use reasons. So that we call analytical meditation and a form of vipassana. Shamatha, the vipassana. And then you'll also use, I think, very detailed explanation. The self-centered attitude, really, long run, harmful. That's I think we really need more education. The best fulfillment, one's own interest, is taking care of others. Because, quite simple, we are a social animal. Self-centered attitude. That through that way, you become very billionaire, but not necessarily happy person.
Yeah.
So taking care more others, say you get more friend at least, or trusted friend, then you feel happy. Without that, you become very rich and more anxiety. Oh, this person also may exploit on my money, or this person also may exploit my money. That's difficult to trust. You're always a little bit of distance. So, the result, the person will not be a happy person.
Yeah.
Always fear, distrust. So I appreciate your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Holiness. And I would like to have some students ask questions. And there was somebody here, you were wanting to ask a question. Could you please pass the mic to over here? Yeah, please.
Students.
Thank you very much. I was asking a question in reference to both Clifford and Rajan's talk because I feel that the science has gone quite far ahead in terms of understanding the mind and the neurological effects of meditation. And as a teacher, how useful are you finding this sort of scientific research? Because I know you're teaching meditation in school. Rishi Valley is one of the finest schools in this country. Are you actually finding any usefulness in what the researchers are doing in the neurological science and biological sciences in your pedagogical approaches with students?
Well, I'm not very familiar with all the research. I mean, I'm sort of aware of it. So it's not that I use it directly in anything I do. But I feel that some of these kinds of mindfulness meditation and so on should be promoted in schools. And therefore, that this research which is establishing that it's beneficial to the mind is very helpful in, getting schools, persuading schools and so on to take up these practices and introduce them at the school level. So that way it's very helpful. There is, as Clifford himself pointed out, a danger of lack of context. Some of the same kind of practices, just like yoga and so on, devoid of their original matrix or context, can become just ways of, say, making more money on Wall Street, making more efficient managers. So that is something which needs to be guarded against. And I see that as potentially a problem. So it's important that the context from which these practices emerged is retained. Now, as His Holiness said yesterday, you can't do it in a religious form because then they'll say you're converting everyone to Buddhism or whatever it is. So you have to find a more secular kind of argument for things like the need to overcome self-cherishing and so on without relying on religion, and embed these practices in that context. That is a task we need to do on a much bigger scale than is happening. Individuals are trying to do it here and there. But for a transformation of global consciousness, this has to become more of a movement.
I just want to add one, because in applied ethics, which is what Buddhism is to a large degree, I just felt that India, and His Holiness has been very much pushing all of us, India can really lead the world because the context of many of these mind training techniques has come out of India. And whether Indian schooling systems can really inform on applied ethics based on science, an education system in the world. And I really felt the educators here could really take that as a challenge, that India leads the world in this sort of modeling and doing research in India. Most of our research coming out right now is from America. And to see that this research may have, a sort of universal way of, being of study.
Yes, we just we'll invite you. Just one. Thank you for your comment. Any question? Anybody has the last question that we can entertain for this speaker?
There's a hand at the back.
Yes, please pass on the mic. Yes, please get up. Yeah.
Please come up front. Come. Take the mic.
Yeah, just take the mic in your hand, please.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. When you were giving your examples, I was just wondering that if I were to rephrase this entire thing and say that students' analytical skills should be nurtured in students, and thorough reasoning would form a very important part of analytical skills, then I wonder what would be the role of meditation in schools. If reasoning and analytical skills could be taught, then what is the additional input of meditation in schools? It's just a clarification.
See, just analytical skills, there's this danger, as I said, analytical skills alone can be used on Wall Street and so on. Okay? So meditation is a process, the way I understand it, by which you expose incorrect reasoning. You know, it's incorrect reasoning which makes one justify Wall Street. Okay, the way it has been functioning in the last 15, 20 years, at least I feel, is unacceptable. And since they have such a powerful influence in the world, they need to be questioned. So when I say, when you ask what is the role of meditation, it's not just analytical skills in the abstract. These analytical skills are used in order to expose what I call incorrect reasoning. And this exposure of incorrect reasoning and the development of correct reasoning is what I am calling meditation. One type of meditation. Okay? So, for example, in the example I took, the dangers of self-cherishing, the complement of that is the advantages of cherishing others, helping others. So both these are based on analysis. And when you look at the advantages of cherishing others, it's based on a valid understanding of reality. I don't have time or the space here to say why it's based on a valid understanding of reality. But let me just say, if self-cherishing is based on the idea that I'm an isolated individual and I must protect myself, that idea is deeply flawed. We all exist in dependence on each other. There's nobody who can be an isolated individual. And examples were there in yesterday's talk about how a child, an infant, is deeply dependent on her mother. And without that dependence, without that nurture, without that care, that child is dead. If not physically dead, psychologically tremendously disturbed. So this dependence never ceases. In the example I gave of the family, the father, he is dependent. He may want to ignore his wife and children, but he can't get away from it. He can't get away from their sadness, their tragedy. It affects him subconsciously. You see, so the truth is this mutual dependence. And that's what needs to be communicated in schools. About development, that's an application of it. But fundamentally, the understanding that we are all dependent on each other, we are dependent on nature. These are crucial things which education must teach. So just analytical skills alone are promoted by institutions all over the world, but since then they are used, they may be used in the Pentagon, they may be used in intelligence services, that's not going to help the world. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yes, we know that reasoning is very important, and it is important also while you're doing meditation. And Your Holiness, you have already pointed out that whenever we are adopting any practices, we need to reason why we are adopting. We don't need to just go by devotion and faith alone, but there has to be a reason why I adopt a particular kind of meditative practice. So thank you so much for a very enlightening session. Now we move to the next speaker, Dr. Nandini Chatterjee Singh. She, if you kindly note that the abstract which is circulated in the booklet is not the one that she's presenting. Her title of the presentation is Parsing the Emotional Architecture of Ragas, Implications for Classroom Teaching. And I'd like to briefly introduce Nandini, my good friend. Dr. Nandini Chatterjee Singh is a cognitive neuroscientist at the National Brain Research Center in India. Her work uses functional neuroimaging to understand brain networks underlying language, literacy, and music. In particular, she has focused on pediatric imaging to understand how children learn to read different languages. And today she is focusing on emotions and how the importance of music in emotion. Nandini, please.
How do you switch this off?
Hello? Yeah. Your Holiness, I would first just like to say this is an honor, a privilege, and with great humility, I come here today to share some of our work with you. It is my first time at a Mind and Life meeting, and I'm very thankful to Dr. Meenakshi Thapan and Clifford Saran for bringing me to this platform. One of the reasons why I changed the abstract also, and I must admit it was very last minute, but as I saw the titles for the other presentations come together, I thought some of this recent work that we've been doing on Indian classical music would gel better with the central theme of the meeting. Okay? And after hearing His Holiness yesterday refer to emotions and music as both integral parts of our life, I'm only too happy to have made that decision. So this is work we have been doing recently at the National Brain Research Center where I work. And the young lady on the screen is Avantika Mathur, who is really the person who has been doing the work. I have the privilege of presenting it and sharing it with you today. So, as you pointed out yesterday, Your Holiness, emotions are very central to human existence. And it is these emotions which are responsible for guiding social behavior, moral systems, and in fact, almost the basis of civilization. And a lot of the decisions we take on an everyday basis, a lot of the way we behave even in society. Okay? It's interesting, but music is also believed to be a very important source for evoking emotion. It's a very important socio-cultural stimulus. And research over the last few years has shown that this music not only has the ability to reach out to the sensory experience, but also reach out to what might be underlying more deep experiences, which right now I will choose not to describe and define, but hope over the course of the talk you will begin to appreciate in your own way. Because music is also very personal, like meditation. And I have never worked on meditation. I have never worked on mindfulness. But I can begin to see how we might be able to bring about a connect between the two. Okay. And so, taking this from the neuroscience point of view, as the slide indicates, it reaches out to processes of auditory perception, which is happening at the sensory level. There's sensory motor integration happening. There's memory coming into play, because a musical piece can often bring back a smile to your face. But I also want you to focus on the fourth point, the emotional reward experience. An emotional reward is something that we seek for without explicitly stating so. But we always go back to do an activity which has brought back reward or which has been a source of reward. So the point is, can we go and investigate this a little further and see if this has implications which could be useful in the classroom? To provide some of the biological evidence for it, there is physiological evidence, as the figure on the left shows you, that galvanic skin response, the way your skin responds to pleasurable music, the way your respiration rate changes, the way your heartbeats change. All of this, so there are bodily responses to music, and there are neural responses to music, which the figure on the right shows. Okay? And here you see responses at the level of the sensory cortex and at the level of the basal ganglia. Okay? So here I'm bringing in terminology just to say that the basal ganglia is a very important part of the brain, which is sitting deep inside your cortex. It's not sitting on top. Okay? It's sort of a vague place where we think some part of subconscious experience might be happening. We are trying very hard to try and understand it through different experimental paradigms, but we're just at the tip of the iceberg. There is a lot more that the basal ganglia has to tell us. What we do know, however, is it tells us how often we gate experiences, how a representation of a stimulus is directed by the basal ganglia to get to the concept. Now, raga music, or ragas as we often refer to them in India, have a very, very long tradition. They have been hypothesized many, many years ago to induce emotion, and that has been the basis of the raga rasa theory. The word originates in Sanskrit and is defined as the act of coloring or dyeing the mind, leading you to experience different emotions. And as described in one text, refers metaphorically to any feeling or passion, especially love, affection, sympathy, desire, interest, motivation, joy, delight, and often compassion. And I'm sure each of you sitting in this room has experienced all these emotions through music at some point or the other in your lives. But there has sadly been little investigation from a scientific angle whether there is indeed a mapping between the raga that is being played or the notes that have been used in the raga and the specific emotion experienced. Because as you can see, there is a whole plethora of experiences and emotions that we are talking about. Okay? So we set out to try and understand this in a very simple way if possible. So to get to a little definition, a raga uses a combination of 5 or more musical notes to construct a melody. It is typically presented in 2 sequences. The first is typically in the form of an alap, which is a note-by-note delineation of the raga. It is slow and is not bound by a rhythmic cycle. And I think nothing better than to give you a glimpse of the experience. Okay. So I will play a small piece. Your Holiness, may I play a small piece? Sorry. That was just 30 seconds. But Did any of you feel a change in any emotional state? Yes. What was it? Thank you. Clifford says peaceful. Okay? And we want to hold on to that idea and come back in a minute. What? Okay. And now I will play what is typically presented in the gath, which is rendered at a faster tempo and is often accompanied by a percussion instrument. So I don't know whether it is my imagination or if some of you started to smile when that piece started to play. Okay? So it did bring about a change in emotion, and I played it for just 30 seconds. Your Holiness, did you feel any difference? Yes, certainly. Well, certainly the tempo was experienced, but what I'm hoping also is that we were able to convey that even in their short presentations, these are powerful pieces which can cause differences in the emotions that they evoke. And this is what we wanted to study a little more in detail. So we conducted a study online, on the internet, because that seems to be the best way to try and reach out to a large audience. And Your Holiness, we were very keen that whilst conducting this experiment, we wanted to encourage people from across the world to try and participate, because somewhere there is a belief too that this music is universal, which from a cognitive science point of view tells you that there might be some information contained in the acoustic features of the music. The way the notes are combined is a universal way that we could try and reach out to what starts out as a sensory experience, but will hopefully end up as an emotional experience. Okay? The study is still available online, so if any of you wish to take it, please do so. Okay. So we had chosen 12 ragas that were played in Alap and Gath, the two renditions. There were 3-minute renditions that the person who actually composed the pieces for us came up with. Each person who took the study had to rate it. Each piece was rated for 8 emotions, okay, which are listed below. Happy, romantic, devotional, calm, angry, yearning, tense, and sad. Okay. Broadly, they fall into 2 categories. So the idea was, Your Holiness, that they would listen to a piece of music for 3 minutes and then rate if any of these emotions were actually evoked when they were listening to that piece. Okay. So there could be 0 of angry, 0 of romantic, 3 of calm, 1 of happy, and notice the appearance of the word devotional. This is again something which is sort of very prevalent in the Indian context. And I know a lot of people from the West who wrote back to me saying, we never associate the word devotion in music, but in India, devotion and music are inextricably linked. Okay? And a lot of this actually starts out in temples. So here's the data that we have, okay? Just to give you a small flavor of it. We had people from 9 countries who participated. Roughly half and half. Half were people from India, half were people from other parts of the world. Almost equal numbers of males and females. And the age group spans people from the age of 15 to the age of 70. Actually, it's a very broad spectrum. And I guess that covers most of the details about the participants. So based on the 2 small pieces that you hear, and maybe some experience that you have had with music, do you think there is any one emotion that people would rate across all musical pieces of raga music? Anybody? Just take a guess. Thank you. Thank you so much for preempting my next slide. Okay. So after we played these pieces, here is what was the most interesting result for us, which is what we want to build on further. Your Holiness, if you see, across all the 12 pieces of raga music, each of those columns represents one raga, and there is alap and gath both played. If you look in the center, there is calm and soothed. And everybody has rated almost all ragas as calm and soothing, irrespective of whether they are played in alap or gath. Okay? The degree varies, but notice that they induce a feeling of calm in everybody. Okay, I can use the mouse. Yes. So this is the row I'm talking about. And then you notice that as the tempo changes, so if you look at the right of the curve, okay, as the tempo changes, as it is played in gath, it moves from calm to happy. And if you remember the first piece that I played for you, when it went to gath, many of you said that it was happy and started to smile. So there is some method to this madness, probably. Okay. It was interesting to see that these were some of the comments that people made whilst they participated in that study. Okay. So I have not told you yet which were the ragas that we used, but you can see some indications. So some people said lighter, smiling, moving. Somebody even said wanting to dance, and then said contemplative, major uplifting. Uplifting, happy, sunshine by the beach, smiles and all. Okay. A stabbing pain expressed with a cry, frankly sad. There were pieces capable of evoking this emotion too. Somebody even said tension, sinister, as if running away. So you're seeing that there's a plethora of emotions that people are already experiencing. Okay? So yes, we are certainly seeing that there are different emotions that these ragas are able to elicit. But what's very encouraging is that across the board, you do see that they are calm and soothing. And here is where I've broken them up into 2 groups, those which were giving rise to more positive, what we are calling positive emotions. So happiness, romantic, calm and soothing come under those categories. And we don't call them negative, but more plenitive emotions in the context of sad, tension, longing. But one point which is very interesting to note is nobody ever said that they made them angry. Okay? And this is something which we also want to take home as a message. Okay? That this seems to be doing well, at least at keeping anger at bay. Okay? Okay. Interestingly, Your Holiness, across cultures, people responded the same way to calmness, whether it was people from the West or people from the East, people not even familiar with the culture, all responded universally to the feeling of calmness. Okay? So here's the idea that one begins to pick up. If one wants to learn from this and take it to our classrooms, given that we know a teacher, when he or she is approaching a classroom, if he is in a calm state, rather than coming into a classroom after going through traffic jams or having had a fight with the housemaid at home, if we can play music in our classrooms or even in our schools early in the morning, before school starts, do you think we might be able to start school on a happier note? Maybe just for 3 minutes? It's an idea which I would like schools and teachers to contemplate about. I'm happy to try and help design even an experiment to see if we think learning improves there. So the two main points that I wanted to make out of this was that calm and soothing emotion seem to be evoked by all ragas. The calm and soothing emotion is universal across cultures and not dependent on musical training. There are other features which are more technical associated with the study, which I'm skipping right now. But I quickly want to move now to results from another small study that we did with school children. And those school children had come into our laboratory to listen to spoken and sung words whilst we looked at their brain activity. Okay? So these are young school children, some of those images you see on the screen, who come into the laboratory where we look at the functional imaging. We have an fMRI scanner at NBRC. And here are the two different kinds of stimulus that they are exposed to. Okay?
Cartoon. Cartoon.
So the brain, just listening to spoken words and words that are sung with two major notes. That's the simple experiment that they do. This was actually done with typical children and those with autism, because we think kids can be helped with music. But what I'm talking to you today is only about the data from typical kids. And look at the brain when listening to spoken words. You can see activity in both hemispheres, primarily in the auditory cortices. There are some subcortical regions which are not shown up here. But look at the brain when it's listening to sung speech, and just the sheer spread of color, which in this case is an indication of the activity, is so much more. That's something which you can easily see and visualize. So the brain seems to respond better to any stimulus presented in the musical setting with the musical tone as compared to spoken words. So how can this research again inform the classroom? Okay. There is work to show that transmission in the classroom is at its best when teacher and student both enjoy the experience. Okay? Pleasant emotions are positively correlated with learning which is motivated in the classroom. Pleasant emotions towards learning form the basis of good learning and achievement. And a desirable goal of teaching is to enhance the motivation levels in the classroom. So here is my humble request. Can we begin to bring in more music into our classrooms? Can we begin to use ragas in school settings? Start the day maybe with a happy raga and end the day maybe with a calm or a contemplative raga. Okay. As we go on to do more research into trying to understand the neural pathways that underlie different emotions underlying the ragas, what we could also start to do is to begin to explore what's coming in from our classrooms, and therefore see whether this enhances the learning experience in any way. I think on the other end, from a meditative understanding, can we begin to try and see if listening or engaging in music of this kind for longer periods is able to also achieve meditative states? A number of musicians, when we see them perform on stage, often give us the feeling that they have gone from the sensory experience to a different experience, which many of us try and want to be part of during a concert or a performance. We are just starting out studies in these areas, and hopefully next time I can share some of that data with you. But ultimately, the message I want you to go home with is that music can lift us out of depression or move us to tears. As Oliver Sacks said, it is a remedy, a tonic, orange juice for the ear. So go home and listen to music today. Thank you so much.
Nandini, for a very, what I would say, very interesting talk.
Thank you.
There is no doubt how music evokes positive emotions. I can only add one thing to it. Being the director of Gandhi Bhavan at University of Delhi, for years together, when we come in the morning, we have been playing Gandhiji's music, the devotional music, and that creates a state of mind which prepares you for the rest of day's activities. So it has a calming effect. It also has a stimulating effect. It also leads to positive arousal, which is very essential to achieve our goals. Just one thing more that I would like to say, as you have very rightly pointed out that positive affect is associated with calming music of the kind that you talked about, the alap and the guts. If we listen to the concerts of our great musicians, how they go on for the entire night to play certain rag, on either on instrument or vocally. So the states of arousal, emotional arousal, they seem to be varying. They depend upon the kind of raga which is being sung or played. It also depends upon the time of the day and many other factors, the receiver's characteristics, the attitude towards music, and many more things. So I remember seeing several depressive patients suffering from depression. They come and tell me, if I ask them, what kind of music do you listen to? And as we all know, that old Hindi songs in India are very, very popular. They're very melodic in nature, but at the same time, they excite us very differently. And most of the patients who are suffering from depression, they happen to listen to sad old songs and triggering the negative effect, enhancing the negative effect. So as a part of therapy, you would like to then change their negative affect to positive affect by involving them in pleasurable music. So thank you so much for highlighting. I think what is very fascinating about your research is that you are also studying the underlying neural mechanisms, which is what is very essential. Now we know His Holiness has been always talking about the neuroscientific approaches which are being adopted when we are indulging in contemplative practices. And since we are living in a world of science today, we cannot undermine the importance of scientific researches. And I do remember having read Cliff's research, and I find that the way the experimental design has been done, using, we in psychology, we are very particular about it, pre, post, and follow-up. And as I learned from Dr. Saran, he's also doing a longitudinal study using the subjects after 6 years of continuous meditative practice. And I think that's a fascinating piece. And we need to really analyze these in a very scientific manner. And that's the way I think we can come out with all kinds of false beliefs about mindfulness, which Dr. Saran had talked about, and many of us are very familiar with. We try to use them as quick remedies, which they are not. So thank you so much, and there is still time, and Your Holiness, if would you like to make a comment on Nandini's presentation? it'll be nice because I know how important this field is.
So it seems, you see, many people, I think, you see, loves music. Then I should, because a side rare, it's short. I should be.
Take the aside.
Take their side. Me personally, nothing. You know, I always listen BBC news. When music starts, stop. I want to ask you, you should test someone who very bad sort of mood, then start this music, how much effect on their mind? That I think important.
There is...
person is such full of anger. And then music, some effect, then very good.
So
otherwise, you see the mood, good. And then music come, oh, very happy.
So, Your Holiness, maybe it is reassuring that there is some work to already suggest that sustained musical training does begin to help anger management quite a bit. So there is some hope.
Then I think you say some sort of impractical suggestion. Syria, killing each other. So loud, then start music. If some help, then very good.
Wonderful idea.
It's, so can we open the session for questions? The audience, anybody who would like to ask? Yeah, there is a hand raised there. Could you please take the mic that side? Please get up and take the mic, please. Fast. We have a little time, and we would like to, really get involved. And please do ask questions to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. You will never get this opportunity.
It was a very interesting presentation, and I really agree that music does invoke emotion, and it also uplifts us. My question is, I was wondering, why only limit ourselves to raga? Because I think musical instrument such as guitar and piano can also invoke such emotions. And second is, like, when we listen to music only without the words, we can, the level of interpretation, it is dependent, it depends on us. But when it comes to songs, I mean music with words, I think people can relate to that. So the level of what we can relate is much better with songs. Because there are specific songs for, so many songs are there, like for sad, for love. So what do you think on this?
So thank you for beginning to already venture into the world of experimental science. The questions you have asked actually are important features that we factor into our experiments. To answer your first one, yes, I would expect similar results whether I used guitar or I used piano. But it's important in experimental design that you are able to attribute your results to specific features only. And as you know, these instruments vary in what is called timbre. Okay? So if they vary in timbre, then it is difficult to conclude whether the emotions that I evoke are only because of acoustic features and not because of the timbre. And what would be great is if people went ahead and actually validated this, and we would expect to see similar results, absolutely. In answer to your second question, very rightly put, semantics colors or adds to the experience. But as a consequence, you have to know the semantics, okay? It's possible that there might be a song in Bengali which somebody who does not know Bengali finds difficult to relate to and therefore turns off because the semantics doesn't excite or convince him or her. On the other hand, the advantage with instrumental music is it is able to reach out to a much larger audience. And finally, the attempt was to use and understand the underlying acoustic features. So what I didn't talk about today was that there are what are called Shuddha Swaras, major notes and minor notes. The swaras which are both used in these pieces. And how the role of different intervals is actually responsible with the kind of emotions that they evoke. There are 3 and 4 parts to the study which have answered these questions. And since we didn't get into them, I haven't talked about them right now.
Thank you,
but carry on, yeah.
Nandini, may I add a little?
Sure,
to this?
sure.
Yeah. The question asked is very relevant from the point of view of students, those who are studying. The general pattern that we observe is that while they're studying, the students are on with their music. That's very, very commonly seen. But what is the kind of music that you're listening at that time? If it is involving semantics, please do remember the psychological studies have always shown that you are getting into that state of arousal. So you, instead of studying, instead of focusing on your studies, you tend to be focusing more on the kind of emotional arousal which is there, whether it's positive or negative in nature. So in that sense, maybe the calming instrumental kind of music which does not involve any semantics might be much better to bring the calmness effect. I think that does make sense.
Sure.
His Holiness may not agree. Yeah, there is another question at the back. Please do ask.
Hello. I would like to ask, what is your take on different kinds of genres which are not necessarily sometimes critically, like they're not considered music. For example, like genres of death metal, heavy metal, rock music, blues, or maybe hip hop, rap, which sometimes parents are also very concerned that their children should not listen to a particular kind of music, song, a genre. So I would like to ask, what is your take on that? And as His Holiness pointed out, like, what if a person is very agitated and very angry, then you put on some music? For example, for me personally, when I'm really angry, if I listen to death metal or thrash or a particular subgenre of rock music, it really calms me down, even when I'm really angry. So I would also like to ask you, in the future, would you like to do some research on these particular genres as well of music, which have also faced a lot of like heat from the parents like protesting against these kind of musics, which so I would also like, was wondering whether in the future you would want to do some research on this particular kind of genre. Thank you.
Would you like to come and do some this summer?
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely, most welcome.
Thank you.
So whilst we haven't actively worked in this area, it's something that students are often excited by, is because, again, like we've addressed earlier, music seems to be one universal language, and there are different genres. I'm still, so there are parts of rock music I love, okay? However, I've also noticed that maybe there is an interesting, if I may call it, developmental timeline to it. So maybe when I was your age, I loved rock music much more than I like it now. My daughter loves rock music right now, okay, and loves heavy metal. But at this age and stage in my life, I'm a little more attracted towards music of the kind I played. But I certainly see the relevance of the kind of music you're talking about because of the level of connect it builds in. How we will answer parents and concerns in music, I think we have a lot more research to do along those lines. But I think that that day is not very far away when we will be able to find some answers. But it's what we are beginning to certainly look at now, or at least there are other studies which are coming into place. What can we learn from acoustic structure of these pieces versus the kind of networks that are activated by them, to see what are they able to reach out to. So why is it that you find rock music more attractive? Does it activate your reward pathway much more than a particular kind of music that I have played, okay? So is it somewhere the kind of reward that this activates, because of which it allows you to go back to it again and again? And as you pass through a stage in your life where there is greater change or uncertainty happening, is there a correlation with that? And as you get to slightly older states, or states where there is more stability, does one begin to see a difference or change in musical states? What we do know across all these studies, and this is largely work done by Robert Zatorre, is music that gives you pleasure. Okay? And he's done this with college students. Music that gives you pleasure is certainly something you go back to again and again. The levels of pleasure that we actually go back to vary from person to person. And this is manifested even, I think, even in the kind of books we all read and like. So these are sort of more personal features that come in, but maybe studying them over larger groups of students will begin to provide some understanding of how they correlate with different levels of not only brain development, but even hormonal change. And that kind of research is just beginning out right now.
Thank you very much, Nandini. It's a very exciting field. The question asked has got a lot of relevance for the present day youth in society. And it is not all right for the parents to always check them, because I know those who are into rock music, they also get into the same kind of positive emotional states as anybody else, any other kind of music which has a calming effect. So, of course, we need to do further research in this area. We can still entertain. Yeah, there is one question. Yeah, could you please pass the mic to her?
Well, I'm delighted we've at least woken up the students a little bit.
Yeah, that's very nice. Students are coming up.
Ma'am, I have a question.
Sure.
Regarding the suggestion you gave that maybe this kind of music can be incorporated in the school routine. But my question is, if the same music is played again and again, don't you think the effects would reduce because it will become monotonous?
Very valid point again. So the idea is not to use the same music every day, but to pick out pieces that we already know evoke certain emotions and to mix them. So on a particular day you might play Desh, on a second day you might play Rag Tilakam Mod, on a third you might play Hansudhani or whatever. But the idea is to have done a little bit of background research to know that these are the ones that you know have been successful and to use them imaginatively. Your point is very well taken. You'll get bored after a couple of days and it might actually begin to reverse effects that you might have seen in earlier days. But as a starting point, it seems to be a simple enough suggestion to implement right away.
Thank you. Yeah, there is a hand there. Please.
Hello, I'm Parimala from Teacher Training Institute, CIE. I just have 2-3, the suggestion I want from your side. One is that, as a parent of 2 children, my child also go to music class, and she also having in the school for Hindustani and Indian music and Western music. And apart from that, when I take her for her evening music class, it's not a full-time music teaching is going on. Now we have a part-time teaching only in the music. So when I take her, she said that, Mama, I used to sit in my classroom very silently, even I can't turn here and here, and I have to put my mouth, closed, and I have to only, observe my teacher. You are taking, after I reaching home, you are taking to music class. There I have to keep open my mouth almost, 1.5 hours continuously. How you are thinking that, no, because he also interested in music, but the kind of the structure we are having, I think you are understanding. The kind of the structure we are having, I want suggestion from you that give me some suggestion for the teacher training institute also to how do we have to inculcate such kind of the techniques into our classroom system, because now the educational system is very formal. So I was thinking in a very societal way of out of this room, and how to reach everyone have to experience that music, and how then that has to be happen in the classroom, so that when it has to become in the classroom means it's not only with the music teacher, it should be come with all the teacher. Okay, so giving some kind of the expression of the student in the classroom, so that silence are now happening even the college level. So how do we have to integrate such kind of the policies, or
maybe we
yeah.
can cut short. Time is running
So
out.
that would help us to inculcate, then we can train and they can go to classroom, they can, involve such kind of the practices.
I think we'll have to have another conference to answer that, I'm afraid. So I think there are a number of people sitting in this audience who have had a wealth of teaching experience, who might be able to answer your question much better. I don't think I'm very competent to respond to it right now. Maybe we can chat a little bit over lunch over it on a personal level.
Yes, it's true. There is no dearth. I'm sorry, we're running out of time. Okay, quick question, please, quickly. Somebody should pass the mic, please.
To the Holiness.
Quick question and quick answer, please.
I'm sorry, that's going to be a question to Clifford Saran. Okay. Has there been any research done related to mindfulness practices, like related to teachers and the effect that it has on children and classrooms?
So this is actually the focus of Kim's talk today. So there's a number of projects going on.
I think that's really a quick response and a very apt response. Anyway, I would take this opportunity to thank all our distinguished speakers for the session. Dr. Saran, Mr. Chendi, and Dr. Nandini Singh. I think it's been a great pleasure of mine to have moderated this session. And I don't think in my life I could have achieved better thing than this, to get an opportunity to be the moderator in a session which is being presided by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I am so grateful to it. And I would always want his blessings for our happiness. Thank you so much, and thank you once again, Meenakshi, for giving me this wonderful opportunity. Thank you.